Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Jim Rosenberger, Director of NISS, and I'm pleased that we can host this sixth webinar in our COPSS-NISS series on COVID-19 data science webinars. COPSS is the Committee of Presidents of Statistical Societies, which includes ASA, ENAR, IMS, SSC, the Statistical Society of Canada, and WENAR. I want to thank Shihong Lin, Chair of the Organizing Committee, and everyone who has helped organize this series of webinars. And thanks to Glenn Johnson at NISS, who's providing additional technical and communication support for this series. Participants are all muted, but we encourage you to put your questions during the session into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Today's webinar was organized and will be moderated by Nathaniel Stevens, Assistant Professor of Statistics at the University of Waterloo and a member of the organizing committee. He will introduce our speaker, Angus Bridgeman of McGill University, and moderate the Q&A at the end of the webinar. I now turn the webinar over to Professor Nathaniel Stevens. Take it away.
All right, thank you very much. Angus, if you want to use this opportunity to begin sharing your slides while I introduce you. So Angus Bridgeman is a PhD candidate in political science at the McGill University. He's a research fellow at the Center for the Study of Democratic Citizenship, and he works with the Media Ecosystem Observatory. He's also affiliated with the Center for Media Technology and Democracy, the Max Bell School for Public Policy, and the Network Dynamics Lab. His research interests include studying the participation and motivation of online political activists using survey, census, and social media data. And today he's going to talk about COVID-19 misinformation and attitude formation among the Canadian public. And Angus has expressed to me his interest in answering questions as they arise, not just at the end. And if there's a discussion and dialogue that needs to happen as he's going through the presentation, that is welcome. As Jim just mentioned, please put your questions in the Q&A box. If one seems pertinent, I'll ask it of Angus in the moment. Otherwise, maybe broader, more general questions, I'll just wait until the end to ask Angus. So please keep that in mind and join me in welcoming Angus. Thank you for being here today. Angus, you're still muted. There you go. Oh, you're muted again. There, I can hear you now. Your closed captioning was working.
That's great. We'll just do the closed captions. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming, and thank you to the organizing committee and to Nathaniel for inviting me. I'm really excited to be sharing some recent work that I've been doing on misinformation and attitude formation among the Canadian public. This is obviously a really big topic right now. It was in the early days of the pandemic when a lot of the misinformation was circulating, was sort of prompting people to not socially distance, not wear masks, etc. And it's become a really big issue again as the vaccine rolls out, and there's a lot of vaccine hesitancy material out there. So really gonna dig into sort of how this stuff has been rolling out in Canada and what we can learn from it. So I just want to give kind of a big some context about my presentation today. First, sort of historically, most of our information came from those we knew and trusted. So in political science, we talk about politicians, we talk about maybe trusted newspaper editors, trusted friends, family. These are the folks that we're getting information from, we trust, and we make up, we form our attitudes, and our behaviors are informed by that. So that's kind of how it worked historically, but over time, with newspapers, television, and now social media, our information sources have become quite a bit more fractured. So now we're getting information from a large number of sources, many of whom we don't know personally, and maybe have some incentives to mislead us. Specifically, kind of for my research, it's social media information consumption that is really rapidly increasing. So the majority of Canadians now get some or most of their news from social media. This is in line with falling rates of television and news media, traditional news media consumption. So as social media rises, there's this concern about sort of where this information is coming from and whether or not we can trust it. Importantly, there's very few sort of formal democratic governance or oversight mechanisms on social media platforms. A lot of what's being done is voluntary, sort of self-governance, voluntary governance by Facebook, Twitter, Google, etc. So these platforms are saying, you know, we're moderating the content, don't worry about it. So this stands in contrast to sort of television and news, which maybe operated like that at the very beginning, but very quickly were regulated. And so you had standards that emerged that sort of governed the way information was shared on those platforms. So social media is still kind of operating in that wild west. So today I'm going to tell a story of 3 papers. Probably like many of you, kind of January last year, I can't believe it's been 13 months. You know, we were squirreling away on our research problems or on our research interests, and suddenly there's this enormous life-changing, society-changing event that occurs in obviously the novel coronavirus. And I think many social scientists, epidemiologists, and others sort of turned towards this and said, okay, how can we study this? And I was no different. So early on in the pandemic, I noticed that there was a lot of misinformation being propagated by political elites. Obviously in the United States, that story is well known, but in other places around the world as well, like the United Kingdom and Brazil, the Philippines. So there was all of this poor quality information coming out from political elites who, for whatever reason, were downplaying kind of the severity of the pandemic and saying, don't worry too much. So I wanted to understand kind of how that was playing out in Canada. That led me to sort of finding out that actually Canadian politicians weren't propagating a lot of misinformation and generally were aligned. There was a cross-partisan consensus, and so I'll walk through that in a few minutes. So then I sort of said, okay, well, where's the misinformation coming from then? Because there are high levels of misperceptions, and there is a lot of behavior in Canada that suggests that people are getting information from other sources. So that led to the second paper, and then, you know, once sort of we dug into the social media angle, we wanted to understand sort of the porousness of national boundaries. So, you know, traditional information sources tended to be geographically based, but with social media, especially social media like Twitter or Reddit that are not very strongly geographically based, there's a lot more porousness. So that's the third paper. The first 2 have been published in special series on COVID-19, and the third one, I'm pretty happy to say, just got revised and resubmit this week. So excited to dig into those revisions and hopefully see that published in a month or 2. A couple things. Yeah, as Nathaniel mentioned, if you have questions, feel free to type them in. I like to respond to questions in the middle of the presentation. So if I'm not being clear or there's something missing, please let me know and I will do my best to reply in the moment. I'm covering 3 papers, each with distinct methodologies, theories, and outcomes. I'm covering 3 papers in about 30 minutes. So it's going to be relatively quick. It's going to be at a high level. Really excited. If you want to talk more about methods or some of those details, happy to talk about it in the Q&A, or this PowerPoint will be up on the website at some point later, or you can just search the titles. And so for the first 2 papers, and then the third one hopefully will be out in a month. But if you're really interested in getting it before then, my contact information is at the end of the presentation. Reach out and I'm happy to send you a working copy of that. So I'm going to talk about the 3 papers and then talk about some of the big think. Last thing, for anyone who's sort of really interested in causal inference out there, none of these papers are causal. I think people who work in social media studies would love to make stronger causal arguments, but you have enormous self-selection problems. So I'm not making any very strong causal arguments here, although I will say that the scope and scale of the issue and the evidence kind of marshaled here strongly suggests that this is a big part of the causal story, even though I can't properly identify it. So there's my disclaimer right there. I don't want to see anyone sort of being, hey, you can't causally say that. Okay, so let's dig in with the first paper, a rare moment of cross-partisan consensus. So obviously, different political parties have very strong incentives to have differing policy positions. It's how they maneuver and try to win different votes. So it's very rare that you have full agreement on an issue. So we wanted to understand, okay, so how are politicians responding to the COVID-19 pandemic in the early days? This is published in a special issue of the Canadian Journal of Political Science. So 3 sort of data sources. We have a multi-wave survey. We have social media posts collected from all active members of parliament on those platforms. And then we used Google search history in 87 Canadian cities. So how did the Canadian parties respond to COVID-19? So here's a plot. Along the x-axis, you have month divided into 3 issues. Along the y-axis, you have the percentage of the tweets that the politicians shared with sort of topic-specific keywords. I've put COVID-19, immigration, and the environment beside each other. Immigration and the environment are the 2 sort of major issues in the Canadian kind of political discourse these days, apart from COVID-19. So you can see that, you know, the levels were relatively high at the beginning of the pandemic. This is based on 33,000 tweets collected from, I think, about 300 active members of parliament, which is the equivalent of the US House of Representatives. Did a keyword search and look pretty, you have that little spike in early February when the first case was found in Canada. And then you sort of see an upward trajectory. And of course, that's continued and sort of was actually highest in May and June in the Canadian context. We've continued to track these data. Meanwhile, the other 2 main issues, immigration and the environment, quickly dropped, with the exception of the Conservative Party continuing to talk about immigration. And this was largely a discussion and debate around how the borders should be closed. So this wasn't a de-emphasis of COVID-19, it was actually a stronger emphasis on it. So what you see is all the parties talking about it, everyone sort of uniformly stressing the importance of social distancing measures and large-scale government action to combat the pandemic. We did a manual review of all the COVID-19 related tweets. There was not a single federal politician of any party that downplayed or denied the importance of COVID-19. So this is quite striking in that, at least in the Canadian context at the federal level, there was this strong consensus. There's been a bit of fracturing since then, particularly at the subnational level, and I can talk about that if people are interested. So given these very strong elite cues, we wanted to understand how partisans reacted to these elite cues. Did partisans change their attitudes about, or did they have different attitudes based on sort of their partisanship? In the United States, I'm sure people have seen the figures. There were very dramatic differences between Democrats and Republicans in terms of their perception of the severity of COVID-19 and whether or not they were social distancing. So this is a coefficient plot. Along the x-axis, you have the effect on the dependent variable. There's 3 different dependent variables: the severity of COVID-19, and then 2 social distancing indexes. One is around offline behavior, so meeting people face-to-face, social gatherings. The other is online behavior. So that's you know, doing online shopping, that's taking meetings virtually, seeing people virtually, and working from home if possible. So what do we see here? We have the ideology measure up top, and then we have the 3 parties. The reference category is the current ruling Liberal Party. So the party that you might expect there to be some difference, the Conservative Party, no, we didn't find any statistically significant difference, and very close to 0 in direction as well. They are not, conservative partisans in the Canadian context are not downplaying the severity, and they are engaging in similar social distancing measures to partisans of the Liberals, the NDP, and the Greens. The only kind of category here is this policy-based ideology. So while partisans themselves, who are taking very strong cues from their elites, are not changing their or are sort of all in sort of a similar boat, there is some difference with ideology, and so we can talk about that in the Q&A to some extent. But this is sort of saying there's something other than partisanship going on. So there's a community that has some strong policy positions that maybe is getting information from other places than their party, and that's informing the way they responded to COVID-19. We also did this sort of cute thing. You see this in a lot of papers. It's kind of fun. You know, you look at the Google search data across cities, and we look at, you know, where is information about COVID-19 being searched, and sort of, you know, based on an urban index and based on a socioeconomic status, so wealthier cities versus relatively poorer cities. What we find is that dense and large cities are obviously searching about it more. These are also cities that tend to have large international airports, so they're more exposed. More educated and wealthy cities, again, searching more. We looked at whether or not conservative vote share in the last election was important, and again, nothing. So we've sort of triangulated that probably partisan cues are not playing an important story in, spreading misinformation or producing misperceptions about COVID-19. So what's the bottom line? Elites are providing very strong cues and increasingly using social media to signal strong positions. Cross-party consensus can be a very politically powerful tool, especially in the early days of the pandemic in Canada. When people were this was a new issue, they were looking to their political leadership, there was very rapid response amongst the mass Canadian public. We can talk about some of fracturing that's happened since then, but definitely at this time, there was really, okay, this is serious, everyone, let's buckle down, let's get to it. So if that was the case, when the data for this went up until the end of, or mid of April, we started to notice at the end some fracturing of this. And so we thought, okay, well, if people are defecting, if they're not social distancing, if they're not taking COVID-19 very seriously, where else might they be getting their information? And that sort of led us to the next paper. I'm just going to pause here before I move to the next paper and see if there was any question from the audience that anyone had asked, anything clarifying about this first paper.
I see no questions just yet, but I had one or two of my own. Could you maybe go back to the plot, with the line plots with the three different parties and the three different conversation topics on Twitter? It's interesting to me that the NDP, it looks like that initial hump around the first wave is roughly, I don't know, maybe one to 2 weeks ahead of the two larger parties in Canada. And I wondered, from a political standpoint, what is your opinion of that? And was there something going on there where the NDP is more aware or more worried about the pandemic earlier on than the Conservatives or Liberals?
So this is interesting because those of you who are Canadian or sort of follow the Canadian information environment, this was actually an anti-Chinese racism push by the NDP. So in the early days in Canada, there wasn't a large number of events, but there were enough sort of incidences of people either being refused service or being discriminated against on public transit, who Chinese Canadians or people of Chinese origin, that the NDP kind of pushed this item onto the agenda, saying, hey, we shouldn't call this the Chinese flu, for example, and this is very serious, but we shouldn't be discriminated against Chinese Canadians or people of Chinese origin. So that's kind of like that initial bump, and that's what that looked like. They've since been sort of mocked a little bit ruthlessly. The Liberals caught on to this as well, and in hindsight, it looks very bizarre to hear people talking about in early February this as the major issue, as opposed to what we now know is just this rapid increase in number of case volume in the Canadian context and internationally. So it's a bit of a funny artifact of history, and some fun interviews taking place at that time. So.
Okay, and so my second question was actually with the next slide. I was wondering if you could just explain in a little bit more detail what those dependent variables are. I noticed on the horizontal axis it says 0 and 1. So it was a binary indicator somehow measuring how people perceive the severity and how they perceived social distancing and its effects on COVID-19?
Yeah, so they're all factor-loaded indexes on a set of questions. So severity asks a number of questions about, how severe do you think the pandemic will be for the economy, for your personal life, for broader society? And then we loaded that onto a 0 to 1, with 1 being all the items and 0 being none of the items. We did the same for the social distancing index. I think there's 11 items there loaded onto 2 different factors. So that's that.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's just a linear regression.
Got it. And so this is where the multi-wave survey came in, I guess. These are survey responses.
Yeah, sorry if that wasn't clear. Yeah, these are survey responses. One of the things you'll notice through the 3 papers is that we've been really trying to utilize, not just social media data, but trying to corroborate that with some sort of survey-based data. They each have weaknesses, but together they can sort of tell a triangulated, stronger story. So that's what we're doing here.
Sure. And I see there's one question from the audience right now, specifically with respect to this slide. Can you define what or who you mean by elite cues?
Yeah, so yeah, this is some political science jargon here. When we talk about elite cues, we mean political elites. So that's elected representatives. That includes anyone who's elected to office. In this case, what we're looking at specifically is federal members of parliament, as opposed to like a subnational or a municipal unit. But what the literature shows is, especially in times of new policy emergence, so when the population doesn't have very strongly sedimented perspectives on something, new policy issue emerges, the attitudes are very flexible based on where sort of people's partisanship aligns. So if you identify very strongly as a liberal and the liberal leader says, this is our stance on the issue, that often will become your own stance. Obviously, we're not talking deterministic, we're talking probabilistic here. But this is a strong effect in Canada, but of course it's dwarfed by in the United States, where partisanship is a very strong motivating factor. And the position that a party takes almost certainly is the same position as an individual will take. So that's what I mean by elite cues.
Okay. And then perhaps a segue into your next section. You mentioned how you've noticed that for the most part, there's been consistency among the political elite or these elected officials in terms of the severity and seriousness of COVID-19, which seems fairly specific to Canada, at least with respect to our neighbors to the south. But even still, you're noticing that there are issues with mask compliance and compliance with adherence to lockdown restrictions and things like that. And so a question has come up, and maybe you'll talk about this later, but do you address the sort of the difference between misinformation as being a potential cause of that? I know you're not making causal associations here, but misinformation versus just COVID fatigue. So just bear in mind that someone has that question, and maybe you can address that if it's appropriate as you carry on.
Yeah, so yeah, I'll address it a little bit later, but thank you for the question. Sure. And
okay.
If I don't get to it, please remind me.
Sure, I will. All right, well then I think we're good to go. Carry on.
Okay, so that brings to a second paper published in June this year in the newly launched Harvard Kennedy School Misinformation Review. That sort of asks, okay, so we know elite cues aren't really spreading misinformation or casting doubt on the severity of COVID-19. So what's going on? Where is that information coming from? So let's look at social and news media and see kind of what are the sources. And then we wanted to say, okay, so let's find out kind of where it is, and then let's look at what the consequences might be. Again, this is sort of slightly causal language, but I don't mean causally here. I mean association. So can we associate the occurrence of misinformation on certain types of media and associate people's consumption of that media with their later kind of lack of social distancing behaviors or misperceptions about COVID-19. Again, multi-wave survey, large Twitter data set. And for this one, we also developed a comprehensive Canadian news media data set for a period from March to April. Okay, so this is sort of the first plot, and happy to talk about this one for a little bit. Along the x-axis, you just have news and sort of that's traditional news media. So in this case, it's all print and online news sources in Canada. I think there's roughly 8.8 thousand articles kind of identified here. You have 6 different kind of themes, different buckets here for misinformation that was circulating in early days. Some of these seem silly in hindsight. So I don't know if people remember, there was the sort of the bat soup theory about the origin of COVID-19, and there was a lot of discussion of the bat soup. So we looked for that, and I feel silly now. But anyways, that was at the beginning. That vitamin C was a cure. So if you just took like an enormous volume of vitamin C, you would be immune to COVID-19. So that was spread quite a lot. And then there were these other 2 kind of no worse than the flu. And then these conspiracy origin theories. So this is a bioweapon. This is George Soros, etc. So these are kind of the 4 buckets of misinformation. And then we looked at also sort of like public health recommendations around like hygiene and social distancing. So the y-axis is the percentage of the content from tweets or from the news sources that contains that misinformation or combats that misinformation. So the y-axis scale varies here, just so that you can see them, but obviously vitamin C was much less talked about than no worse than the flu, for example. So the way we did this is we did keyword identification of these themes. Fortunately, they were all fairly straightforward. And then we did a manual review of a random selection, which is where you get those confidence bars. So we had 2 coders go through and code thousands of news articles and tweets that talked about these things and tried to understand to what extent is it propagating the misinformation and to what extent is it debunking that misinformation. So one of the really striking things about this is that the news media is not a major propagator of misinformation. There's a lot more green on the news side than there is on the social media side, although there is some red as well. A lot of sort of op-eds maybe being published in some of the outlets in the Canadian context. By the way, the replication data for this one, this paper is available on the Harvard Dataverse. So if you're interested in kind of digging into that, you can into the raw data, you can definitely go take a look. We also do see though that there is a fair amount of combating misinformation on social media. So there's this kind of like back and forth debate. And there's some interesting literature about that, about sort of when you come in contact with like debunking misinformation, whether or not that actually later down the line potentially leads you to be more likely to have some faith in it because you've encountered it and so you have some sort of familiarity. But the jury's still out on the extent to which that is true right now. But I think it's sort of interesting in this context. Also importantly, we just see that like the news media was talking a lot about hygiene and social distancing, whereas of course that's going to be a smaller percentage of the conversation online. So what do we show here? Basically that there is more misinformation circulating on social media as compared to news media. This is not surprising. I think anyone who's spent a lot of time in social media platforms sort of knows this, but you know, being able to precise it is sort of a useful endeavor of social science. So then we ask kind of what are the consequences of all of this misinformation? So this plot is somewhat similar. It's a coefficient plot. Again, 3 different outcome variables, again, all based on indices. So a misperception indice, I think there were 7 items in the misperception indice, things like the vitamin C, I'm blanking on the exact questions, but sort of like common misperceptions about COVID-19 at the time. You know, you can't get it if you unless you touch a surface and touch your face, like items like that. Again, they're all in the replication materials. Risk perception, so how risky, again, this is that same item from the first paper, or same set of questions, you know, how risky is it? How severe are the effects going to be? And then to what extent you're engaging in social distancing behaviors. So we collected sort of the social and traditional news media data for between March and April, and then this is a survey that's kind of done at the end of that period. And what we find here is that fairly dramatic and opposite effects for social versus news media. So on the social media side, if you are a regular consumer of social media, so that item is based on the number of platforms that you use and the frequency with which you use those platforms for news information. So that's the social media exposure, sorry. And then the news exposure is, you know, how often do you read like the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, etc. And those are both made into indices. So the social media, if you use social media heavily for information, you have many more misperceptions. Your risk perceptions are pretty similar. And you're less likely to engage in social distancing behaviors. And these are fairly dramatic effects. If you look at sort of the opposite for news exposure. So if you're reading a lot of traditional media, you have fewer misperceptions, no real effect for risk perceptions, and you're much more likely to engage in social distancing. So we have this we have this more information on social media than on news media, and then dramatically different effects. Again, this is not causal, but it's sort of telling the story, and I think probably a story that's capturing sort of the underlying truth, which is people who are consuming a lot of traditional news and kind of staying away from the discourse on social media are not going to be exposed to the misinformation. Of course, there's some self-selection issues there. We also just put offline and online discussion here because there's something interesting about this, just where it seems that having some online discussion does increase the misperceptions, but also increases the risk perceptions of COVID-19. So just being kind of part of that discourse can have some small effects as well, not just reading, but also having that sort of deliberation and discussion. For this paper, what's the bottom line? Well, misinformation is widespread on social media, but important caveat, there's some debunking going on. The public health recommendations appear more frequently in news media, and this information quality differential is powerfully associated with misperceptions, risk evaluations, and social distancing. And that kind of is pretty important. So that there's this social media phenomenon, which is driving, to some extent, these misperceptions, is sort of the conclusion of this paper. So upon kind of completion of this paper, we thought, okay, we know that there's more going on social media, but still, it doesn't really explain where it's coming from. So why is there more content circulating on social media, especially given sort of the elite's cues that are not pushing in that direction, and a Canadian information ecosystem that's relatively, of course, has very partisan, ideologically motivated outlets, but generally is fairly centrist and generally sort of has a high level of trust from Canadians. So where is this stuff coming from? And we didn't feel like we'd fully answered that question. So before I move to the third paper, which kind of digs a little bit into this, I'll pause again for an opportunity for questions.
Sure, I'll ask one. Could you go back to your effects plot slide? So you've got these different types of exposure: social media, traditional news media. Again, this is from your survey data. Did respondents have to sort of self-select or identify or quantify, I guess, their own exposure to social media versus traditional news? And if so, do you have an understanding of the distribution of the Canadian public as surveyed in this particular survey, in terms of whether people are more or consume more social media versus news, or maybe the other way around, or is it balanced? I think it might be helpful to understand the context from that perspective.
Yeah, for sure. So I don't have the exact numbers in my head, but yes, these are self-reports. So obviously there's lots of problems, and there's a few papers that sort of say, like, look, especially for traditional news, like self-reported measures aren't perfect, but this is sort of, where do you get your information? Are these questions about? Over half of Canadians say they get some or a lot of their information from social media platforms. So over half now. If you look at that, that's largely Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. Those are the three kind of dominant platforms. There's some good work from Grizd at Ryerson University, who sort of captures exactly the percentages. So you can check out his work. But yeah, generally, there is a population that is very heavily consuming social media news and does not look at all at sort of more traditional news, except for probably on social media platforms. So it's not, it's a bit of a bipolar distribution, where there's not that many people who are kind of just rabid news consumers who get all of their information. People tend to choose one or the other. So it's a bit of a bimodal there if you kind of plot them on either end. But I don't have the exact figures with me right now.
But it's not like there's a strong imbalance in either direction. It seems.
If you'd asked this question 10 years ago, oh, sorry.
Yeah.
If you'd asked this question 10 years ago, it would have been very heavily skewed towards the traditional news, but it is changing very quickly. And year-on-year surveys show that more and more Canadians are primarily getting their news from social media. This is going to be interesting given some of the recent changes, for example, on Facebook around political groups. So maybe in this new news coming out of Australia, where Facebook is going to is going to not be sharing some of the traditional news, but for now, it's just on an upward trajectory.
Mm-hmm. And given what I know where you're headed with your talk, that's potentially a negative thing. So we'll let that segue into your final section.
Okay. The last paper that, I really like this title, Infodemic Pathways. It makes it sound very mysterious and ooh, what could that be? The basic idea is like, we know there's an infodemic going on globally. There's a massive amount of misinformation about coronavirus and about vaccines now. So how does that information move around? And that's kind of what this paper is tackling about. And I know most of the audience is American, so I'm gonna put my finger a little in your eye here and sort of say like, look, us nice Canadians, our elites are behaving, but there seems to be a lot of misinformation coming up from the South. And I'm going to show it empirically and then kind of look forward to maybe a spirited discussion about that afterward, or maybe not. So Canadians massively prefer domestic media sources. So if you ask Canadians kind of like what news do you consume? Yeah, there are people who watch Fox News, who read the New York Times, the Washington Post, and then some of the more out there outlets. Yes, there are, but it pales in comparison to the volume of people who consume Global and Mail, CBC, Toronto Star, etc. So Canadians generally prefer domestic media, and we already kind of established that political elites are generally disinterested in COVID-19 misinformation. It's not electorally advantageous for them up here. So how does misinformation enter the public discourse? Where does it come from? So we did this sort of massive Twitter data collection that I'm pretty proud of, and I'm happy to say that. And so I'll walk you through that in a second. And then we have, again, sort of this survey corroboration. And we look particularly there at US information exposure. So the Twitter data collection, this is all done using the standard Twitter API. What we did is we started with sort of like a seed list of all Canadian members of parliament, senators, and about 800 journalists and news outlets in the Canadian context. And we collected all of their followers on Twitter, so about 6.5 million followers. Then we checked their location and description information for Canadian locations, and we pulled out everyone who we thought was sort of a likely Canadian. So that's 750,000 accounts or so, which represents maybe a fourth of the overall Canadian population as per survey self-reports. So these are people who have like self-identified themselves as Canadians. There might be a problem with this population as compared to the general Canadian population, but given the massive volume, I think that's somewhat unlikely. Then we took all of their tweets and retweets from January 1st to the end of the study, which I think the data cutoff was sometime in November. So that's 452 million tweets that these 750,000 accounts posted. We took the 200,000 most active users, and then we collected all the accounts that they followed. That led us to 9 million distinct accounts. We did the same geolocation process. And what this allows us to do is to get sort of this really interesting map of like every of these 200,000 Canadians, how many people do they follow from other countries? So from Canada, from the United States, from France, from the UK, etc. And that was, again, geolocated using the Google Maps API. We found about 1.6 million Canadian accounts this way, and about 5.4 million US-based accounts, and then many international. Then we collected all of the content that they retweeted and tweeted, and then I'm going to show you some descriptive statistics on them. So this was sort of a gargantuan effort. The data collection of querying sort of 24/7 the Twitter API for this took months, but I think this shows kind of some of the awesome stuff you can do with Twitter data. I wish you could do this with Facebook or Reddit, but of course the geolocation is not available. So inferring location is much more complicated on those platforms. So thank you, Twitter, for providing, social scientists like me endless amounts of data that we can play around with. So I'm just going to walk you through some what I find very scary statistics. You might not find them as scary. Canadians are extraordinarily exposed to US information on Twitter. So of all follows for Canadians, about 55% are of US users. We have about 23% are Canadian. So that means there's 3 times as many followers, follow relationships between Canadians and Americans than Canadians and Canadians. 70% of Canadians follow more US users, and almost 20% follow 10 times or more US users. So this is this plot kind of shows this. This is the ratio here, and this is the percentage of the Canadian sampled. So again, that's the 200,000 people. So you can see here this very large, 10 times more or greater, and very few people follow equal. So Canadians are generally following a lot of Americans on Twitter. What is this? How does this impact behavior? So this plot shows as a percentage of location category follow relationships or retweets, how much is Canadian, how much is American, and how much is in this other category. So these are the follows that we talked about. So about 20% are Canadian follows, 55% are American, leaving about 25% international. I just find these numbers somewhat mind-blowing. So, forgive me for that. All the retweets that they did. So again, using the geolocation, we can do the same thing. So what we find here is about Canadians, when they retweet something, will retweet 8 pieces of US-based content, that is to say, coming from a US user, for every one that they do of a Canadian. So 8 times is just a very high number in my mind. We looked at COVID-19 specific retweets. So this was using a dictionary-based approach, looking for we just did the English language sample. The French language sample we're working on in a separate paper, but the English language sample here does tend to retweet COVID-19 information from Canada at almost double the rate as general retweets, but they still retweet US stuff a lot more. So discussion of like Dr. Fauci in Canada is very high, much higher than sort of equivalent discussion of Theresa Tam, our positional equivalent. So that's sort of interesting. And then when we look at misinformation, what we see here is just this very high number. So 53% of tweets that we categorize as misinformation or as about misinformation, and I can talk a little bit about that. That's using a dictionary by another team of scholars, Ivanaga et al., that they were generous enough to provide. And we did some manual verification of that, and we found about half of the tweets that identified were misinformation. About 30% were combating, and about 20% were about other things. So, we show here 240,000 retweets in the Canadian context. So about maybe half of that is actually misinformation. But we can't read 240,000 tweets, so we didn't do that. Those are just kind of some striking numbers. And then we did this additional test, and that's in the paper, where we looked at whether or not people were tweeting original content. So not just retweets, but tweets themselves based on their exposure to US-based users. So that ratio of follows of American to Canadian. And what we found is that if you follow more American users, you are far more likely to tweet misinformation as compared to if you follow more Canadian users. So that's in the behavioral data. We checked it with some survey self-reports. The dependent variable here is that COVID-19 misperception index that we used in the second paper as well. And we look at this interaction effect between US news exposure and social media exposure. And what we find is actually people who consume US news but are not on social media tend to be somewhat less misinformed. So that's good. If people are not getting US information from social media, but instead reading the Times or the Post or whatever, they tend to be less misinformed. I think that this represents sort of hyper interested people. These are people who really care about politics. And so they have a very good knowledge base. But if you are coming to US-based news through social media, there's this coefficient on social media exposure. So you have more misperceptions if you use a lot of social media. And there's this very strong interaction effect between social media use and US news consumption. So these two pieces of evidence tell the research team that a lot of the misinformation that's entering into the Canadian conversation is coming from US-based sources. Not all of it, and I don't mean to say that Canadians are blameless in this, because they're absolutely not, and there are large volumes of, there are a large number of users in the Canadian context that propagate misinformation. But given our exposure to the US information ecosystem, given how much Canadians are in the gravitational field of the United States, the misinformation that circulates down south doesn't stay there. There's a famous quote by the former Prime Minister, well, Canadian famous quote, about how being Canada is like sleeping next to an elephant, and if it grunts, you feel it. And so I think that really speaks to this this power and the way the infodemic has really entered into Canada. It's not from the political elites who have largely stayed away, but actually it's from this social media conversation, which is largely driven by a US audience, which sort of can take over to some extent the Canadian conversation. An important caveat here is that I'm looking at opt-in follows and self-reported behavior of following US news. Canadians care deeply about US news. It affects us a lot, and that makes a lot of sense. So people choosing to follow Americans, of course, like that makes a lot of sense. But the question is our platforms themselves somehow, through like psychological or algorithmic processes, increasing Canadian exposure to US-based misinformation? And this is like a very important public policy question, and something that the Canadian Parliament is actually grappling with right now, not specifically with regards to this work, but just trying to understand how to govern social media spaces where the Canadian population makes up such a small percentage of the user base. I'll do a wrap up and then we can open up for questions. So I sort of started with this kind of big question about, like, you know, how do you explain misperceptions in the mass population? Where do they come from? Well, I mean, social media is driving a lot of this, and that's the empirical reality. And social media platforms are trying to address this, and they've hired thousands and thousands of moderators, and they have all sorts of AI crawling over their platforms to try to remove this stuff. But it is happening, and it is influencing attitudes and ultimately behaviors. And then the sort of the second big point is that national media markets and information ecosystems are highly porous. When you are so subject to another information ecosystem as Canada is to the United States, you can't just rely on the good behavior of traditional sort of Canadian influencers. You can't rely on the national media or national political elites, because those two sources alone don't convince people. There's this whole other set of information that's coming in that there is no control of, and can you know, can lead to misperceptions and changes in behavior. Next steps in this research agenda on my end, there's this mercurial misinformation problem. Hey, the auto text actually got that word. That's impressive. So misinformation rapidly changes over time. What was misinformation, remember the bat soup, is no longer really part of the discourse. And so we're working on kind of a way to iteratively identify misinformation over time without laboriously doing hand coding each time. There's this self-reported misperceptions problem, where these attitudes are very unstable, and relying on survey data is somewhat problematic in this area, because people don't always reply honestly, and from sort of, if you survey them on a Tuesday and then on a Thursday, their answers might be different. And so that can be a problem. And then, of course, there's huge causal problems with this research, particularly around self-selection, and trying to get at that is quite difficult. With that, I'll open it up for questions. I know we only have about 10 minutes, but I'm happy to answer whatever they have. There are my contact information. There's my contact information, and just a big shout out to the funders, the Media Ecosystem Observatory, the Rossi Family Foundation, and the Government of Canada through Heritage Canada, who support this work. And you know, big thank you to them.
All right, well, thank you, Angus. That was a really, really interesting talk. You know, I'm really happy that you agreed to participate in this webinar. I've got some sort of broader questions. There's one or two here, specific ones in the Q&A, but for those of you attendees here, please, if you have other questions, feel free to ask them now in the Q&A, and we'll try to get through as many as we can in the next 10 minutes. One specific sort of, I guess, procedural question that arose in connection to your second paper was the idea of, I guess, the definition of social media versus traditional news media. And you'd mentioned that in the survey, the larger quote unquote social media sources were things like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. And so a question arose, what if I watched a YouTube video that was posted by the CBC, or a Facebook page or an account that was from CTV News or Global, or, and for our American attendees in the audience, these are Canadian broadcast entities. So how did that survey define these sort of potential sources of news?
This is a great question. Actually, a huge challenge with survey research in this space is that you can ask people, do you read the CBC? And does that mean they go onto their browser and go www.cbc.ca and then read through the thing, and then that's their information consumption for the day? Or do they go on Twitter, look at the CBC, like it happens to pop up in their feed, and then they go, yeah, well, I read the CBC. Like I just read an article this morning through my social media feed. And actually the way the survey questions are asked, we can't disentangle, and I'm not sure how you would actually get at that really well, other than maybe tracking browser history, for example. But I think conceptually, there's a very big difference between consuming news direct from the source and consuming it on social media. And that's that when you consume information on social media, there is a conversation around it. I'm very guilty of this. I'm sure many of you are as well. What do you do after you finish an article? You read the comments. How should I be reacting to this? What are other people's reactions to this? I feel this way. What do other people think? And so when you kind of go through that process, like that is a very different process than opening a newspaper, reading it, and be like, well, I guess I just have to sit with my thoughts and think about it for a little while. You know, you can't have a conversation, with somebody around it right away. So those psychological processes are very different, and it's about sort of seeking information out from your peers, and it's that process which, even if you are primarily reading sort of like traditional news sources on social media, is still leaving you open to all sorts of information. If you check any CBC story about the pandemic, look at the top comments on Twitter. I mean, there is going to be someone in there being like, this is a scandemic, like in the top couple comments. There always is. And so you're going to see that over and over again if you are primarily consuming through social media. But in response for the survey question, it's just a boring, do you consume this? There's no differentiation between the two, even though you're absolutely right. There's a big conceptual difference.
Yeah, I think that nicely handles that point. So regarding misinformation, someone has asked, can you explain in the context of your study the nature of the origin of misinformation? Are people simply inventing stories and myths out of thin air, or are people repeating rumors they hear and perhaps elaborating? Is the intent selfish, narcissistic, malicious, political, reckless, or what?
This is a great question, and thank you for the question. But there are a whole sort of like, what is the fountain of misinformation? And you listed a bunch, and I thank you, because I can just say all of the above. I mean, there are a couple categories that I think are important and worth making clear in our minds. There's this sort of like organic rumor-based misinformation that comes out. It's a way, rumors are powerful and are good information-seeking tools. You have this rumor, you hear it, you do some more research, and you learn through that process. All rumor is not bad. And, if a piece of misinformation is posted on social media and somebody corrects it, like, I'm not going to stand here and go like, hey, you should censor that. That should never have appeared. I mean, that information seeking process is a very healthy one. So that's one thing. There's people with very large audiences who have very strong incentive to mislead. That's the type of misinformation which is more troubling, and is more what I'm talking about here, as opposed to that organic groundswell material, which there does exist, but we have to be honest as well. There are people who have enormous political benefit from misleading populations, and I don't mean just national political actors. I mean international. So there's widely documented disinformation campaigns from a variety of countries targeted at the Canadian, the American, the United Kingdom, that are targeted globally. And so that's the stuff that's more concerning. And so, you can't say like, oh, did that develop organically, or was it a disinformation campaign? It's hard to know at first, but they're kind of, they go hand in hand, and they exist sort of simultaneously. Although, of course, like, I'm far more interested in the disinformation, the trying to use misinformation as a political weapon. That's what is more concerning. And any sort of like regulation or policy recommendations I have around it are around that second type, as opposed to that first. Because if you just try to stomp out any little fire or rumor, you're going to get a very hyper-policed social media space, which I don't think benefits anyone.
Okay, great. So another sort of semantic question about defining misinformation. You mentioned that you looked through the tweets and you had a process by which you categorized tweets as either combating misinformation or just providing misinformation. Can you comment or explain in a little bit more detail how that decision procedure worked? And for example, would you have categorized Great Barrington Declaration as misinformation?
Yes, yes to the question, and yes to that. Although that's an interesting question, and in this instance, I think I'm being somewhat cowardly in that these 4 pieces of misinformation are not as disputed. So the medical benefits of vitamin C. There have been studies into this. Like there's like wide scientific consensus that maybe vitamin C at some point in the, if you have a very severe case, it's important to keep vitamin C levels up, but that itself is not, if that was true, everyone would just take vitamin C and we'd be fine. No worse than the flu. Yeah, I mean, the Great Barrington Declaration and others sort of hint at this. This is a valid criticism, and something that researchers in this space do struggle with, is to sort of say, like, how can we be sure of knowledge? And as things evolve, we do sometimes get it wrong, but we base our evaluation on the best scientific evidence that's available at the time, and we do the best that we can there. This pandemic has highlighted some of the limits of that. I think many people, including myself, were very frustrated about the changing discourse around masks. Masks weren't helpful, they were helpful. Now maybe you should wear 2 masks. I mean, this evolution has been very frustrating. And if I had written a paper about masks, actually, just funny anecdote, one of the questions we asked about around COVID misperceptions was about masks. We had this item in our first 10 waves of the survey. And we had originally put it in there because the government of Canada had recommended that you not wear masks. And so we had sort of said, like, there was an item, will masks prevent you from getting coronavirus? And that was misinformation. That item got pulled as part of that battery. But I mean, I know these are just some scattered thoughts on this question, but this is very hard, and it's something that I take very seriously, and I think about a lot, and try to be as safe as I can. So try to pick the items that we can be reasonably confident are misinformation, and anything that is ambiguous, or we don't have enough information, or I'm not an expert on, I'll try to leave to the side.
Great. Okay, so we have time for one more question. I think I'm going to make this sort of an overarching question. I guess in Canada, what seems clear after your talk is that there's largely a consistent message from the elected officials, but there is this message is in some way polluted by misinformation that we are getting from, it seems like, social media, and that's largely coming from outside of Canada. And so I guess my question is, why does this matter? Do we see that this misinformation and consequently misperceptions, does that lead to decreased mask compliance and adherence to social distancing protocols? Can that be quantified? And if so, returning to the one question from earlier in the talk, how could you disentangle that with just the COVID fatigue that everyone's experiencing?
good reminder of that one as well. We try to do it in this paper. We try to, these are self-reported measures. Social scientists are in the business of trying to do the best we can with imperfect data. Would I like to sit on somebody's shoulder, watch their social media consumption, and then, track their behavior out in the world and then do that for 10,000 people? I would, well, not me, but, I would like that data available, but obviously that can't be obtained. The data in this paper does show that people are less likely to comply with social distancing recommendations. I have no reason to not believe people when they say that they are intentionally breaking the law regarding social distancing. I mean, it doesn't cost them very much to do it in an anonymous online survey, but I see no reason why they would do so. And so I think that we can say that they do matter for the real world. It does affect behaviors. There are large-scale protests. There have been many large-scale protests about the lockdown in the Canadian context, and journalists have gone and asked these people, and they start talking about the forums that they frequent, the social media platforms that they're on, where they're getting their information. And so I think both statistics, like from survey data and from just talking to people on the street, you have some good evidence there. There's unquestionably also a fatigue that is instilling itself on the population. People are sick of being in lockdown. And this doesn't mean that they have misinformation, although it might mean that their risk perceptions are off. I mean, it's possible. These studies were done earlier on in the pandemic. It's not to say that there wasn't already COVID fatigue by the end of the summer, but I think this would be more of a problem now. What we do see in our survey data is a relaxing of social distancing over time. So social distancing was highest in the early days of the pandemic, and it has reduced since. One of the things that's very difficult to disentangle that from like policy changes, particularly at the subnational and municipal level in the Canadian context, where you have different ordinances and different rules. But that's a great paper that somebody should absolutely write. It probably won't be me. Oh, did we lose Nathaniel there?
Yeah, it looks like we might have lost Nathaniel's from the internet.
I think you're right. He is no longer on the screen, but we are at that point in time. Here he comes back. While he's coming in, I want to thank you, Angus. Nathaniel, thank you for moderating this session. Did you have a final statement or question?
No, I just wanted to thank all of you again, everyone who participated, Angus for speaking, and Jim for organizing the technical side of this. I apologize, my internet must have just gone down momentarily. I got kicked out. But yeah, I want to thank everybody.
And let me add my thanks and to the audience for joining us. And remember, in 2 weeks, we have another session on the role of interventions and the crisis of virus in India. So feel free to join us again. And thank you again, Angus and Nathaniel. This was great.